So, I don't know about you guys, but personally, I always love when I come up on a new city or town in a Pokémon game. They're always really fun to explore, and I always look forward to discovering what kinds of cities each new region has to offer. With that said, the cities and towns of Pokémon have gone through a ton of development over the years, and they have a ton of crazy cut content to offer that never made the final games. And that is what I am here to cover today, so let's go ahead and get to it. When it comes to the cut content of cities and towns in Pokémon, the largest amount of info we have in this department currently comes from the earlier days of Gen 1 and Gen 2. For instance, a look at what Kanto's cities looked like early on was recently discovered via a leak of Pokémon Blue's source code. This info has all been cataloged by cut content website The Cutting Room Floor, so a huge shout out goes to them, and it gives us a glimpse at what Pokémon Red and Blue looked like around the time when the series was still known as Capsule Monsters. According to the Cutting Room Floor, the following iteration of Kanto dates all the way back to roughly 1992, which was a whopping 4 years before Red and Blue officially released. As such, not only are the layouts of the towns different, but the entire game had a different look and feel to it altogether. You can see as such in this early map of Pallet Town, which is not only missing Oak's lab, but is also completely surrounded by coastline, instead of just featuring that much smaller outlet to the sea that it has in the final games. Vermilion City and Pewter City, meanwhile, are pretty close layout-wise to their final forms, with the only differences being relatively minor, such as the differently structured wooded area in Vermilion City, and this giant building that stretches down Pewter City's left side, in and around the area where the gym ultimately ended up. Cerulean City, meanwhile, looks significantly different, having a completely different layout and being significantly smaller in terms of the number of buildings present within the city. Next up, however, is Vermilion City, and this is where things start to get crazy. The early maps of both Vermilion City and Celadon City within this source code leak reveal that originally the concepts of each of these cities were flipped. For instance, Vermilion City was originally where the big department store of the game was located, as well as Game Freak's offices, as evidenced by this little sign right here, and likewise, Celadon City was surrounded by water and seemingly had a port for a boat, just like Vermilion City does for the SS Anne in the final games. These two probably have some of the biggest changes of any of the featured towns and cities in this video, and knowing that their roles were reversed at one point is absolutely crazy. Just to the right of Celadon, meanwhile, is of course Lavender Town, and it has some significant differences of its own. Firstly, this iteration of the town is missing its signature Pokémon Tower, and it also has a bit of a different layout, in addition to having some nearby water in the upper right corner, where the Pokémon Tower would ultimately come to sit in the final. That, however, covers pretty much everything from the towns and cities of Kanto. The locations we haven't yet touched on, Fuchsia City and Cinnabar Island, barely even existed at all at this point, so there's really nothing to say about them, which leaves just one more thing to cover for this generation. In the past, there's been a lot of talk about an old map of Kanto from Red and Blue's very early development, which features a town that was scrapped from the final games. It's marked with a C and isn't directly connected on the map to any other location, and over the years, there's been a lot of speculation, including from myself, as to what this town could have been. Well, thanks to this source code leak, we likely have our answer as to what this town was. This map of a scrapped town that was included amongst all the other source code data is most likely the Sea City from that early Kanto map. However, this city itself is very small, and what this map doesn't tell us is what the point of this city was. After all, on the early map, it is the only location that isn't directly connected to any other, and other than Saffron City, who is marked with a T on the map, it is the only settlement that is marked with a letter instead of a number. This makes it seem like this place would have been a special location, but it certainly doesn't look like it, which is certainly cause for confusion. However, I think I have actually figured out what the purpose of this town most likely would have been. I believe that it was probably tied to the SS Anne port in some way as its own location, separate from any other town unlike in the final games. While there isn't anything boat or water related about the town itself, I say this because, first, this town features the infamous truck that does appear at the SS Anne port in the final games. I mentioned in a past video how this is the only place in this version of the games where a truck can be found, and for it to exist with the exact same appearance, despite the drastic change in graphical style in the final games, certainly suggests a connection. And if we tie that connection in with what we mentioned earlier about Celadon City originally being the town with a port, and the fact that that port sat on the south side of the city, and this particular scrapped city sits south of Celadon on that early map, it definitely seems to be the case that this was actually going to be the original SS Anne port, or something to that effect at the very least, and it was originally given its own distinct location, which is pretty wild. I would personally put my money on this being the case, which is really interesting, and frankly, it makes you wonder even more about how that would have worked had it actually happened. With Gen 1 covered, we are now going to take a look at Gen 2, and there are just as many interesting cuts and changes to be had here as well. Obviously, we gotta start with New Barktown, which is where you begin your adventure in the Gen 2 games, and it went through a couple different iterations that we know about. The first comes from the 1997 Space World demo of Gold and Silver, and it features a different layout as well as a Pokémon Center, which a hometown would not end up seeing until Pokémon Black and White 2 about 10 plus years later, and it is still the only time that that has ever happened for a hometown. This particular version of New Barktown would be updated in a couple further iterations, with one existing in the data of the final games themselves, and the other being found via another recent source code leak. What's interesting is that this layout was pretty much maintained all the way up until the graphics for the game had been officially finalized, and yet the final version of New Barktown is still pretty significantly different. Next up are Cherry Grove and Violet City, and boy oh boy do they have some drastic differences. Most shocking of all comes from an early map of Cherry Grove City that comes from the aforementioned source code leak, which depicts Cherry Grove in a very different light. First, it is way bigger, which seems crazy, but actually makes sense since the location of Cherry Grove City is based on Nagoya, Japan, which is Japan's fourth biggest city in total. It also features the traditional Japanese-esque buildings that are seen in the final games in Violet and Ecruteak City. A similar iteration of this map, albeit with these buildings removed, was also included in the data of the final games. And speaking of Violet and Ecruteak City, conceptually, they actually used to be one whole big city before being split into two, and that city was known simply as Old City. It featured in the 1997 Space World demo and was located roughly where Violet City is in the final. However, Violet and Ecruteak also have other early iterations of their own, coming from both the source code leaks and found within the final games, and as you can see, they are all wildly different to what we got in the final. In particular, it's worth noting that this early version of Ecruteak contains a railway on the south end of town, possibly indicating that the magnet train was originally planned to be located here instead of in Goldenrod City. However, speaking of Goldenrod, we also have some early looks of it as well, which also feature a railway for the magnet train, calling into question what actually was going on with the magnet train at this time. Anyway, there are some differences between these early versions of Goldenrod and the final, but ultimately it is fairly similar to the finished product overall. Meanwhile, what is not so similar to the finished product is Azalea Town, because it is actually the result of two towns being combined into one. Within the final game's data and the aforementioned source code leak are two towns that went completely unused and are very small overall. Thanks to an early region map of Johto that also came from this source code leak, we can actually locate these two towns on the map, and see that they sit side by side exactly where Azalea Town is located in southern Johto. However, there is no Ilex Forest present in this version of Johto's map, meaning that the thought process here was most likely to combine these two tiny towns into one, since they didn't really need both, and then use the resulting extra space to create Ilex Forest. Meaning that these towns, while looking pretty insignificant on their own, actually helped to create a pretty iconic section of the Johto region and the Pokemon world. Moving along, we've still got a decent handful of towns to cover here, continuing first with Olivine City. While still serving the same general purpose, this early version of Olivine was quite a bit bigger, and interestingly, did not have an outlet to the left of the town that would have ended up leading to Cianwood City like it does in the final. Instead, the only way in or out of the city is the route to the north that you come into the city from, and the port to the south. Continuing on though, Mahogany Town also had its differences early on in a couple different variations. Notably, the one from the source code leak doesn't feature a gym, which lines up with the early version of the Lake of Rage also having a town around it as well as a gym, and the popular idea that these two were eventually merged into one for the final game, similar to Azalea Town, which would also explain why you can fly to the Lake of Rage in the final product. Finally, the last Johto town we have to cover today is Blackthorn City. This early version of it that can be found in the final game's data is very different, having an entrance to the left of the city instead of the north from the ice path, and also not having the Dragon's Den. But, as the cutting room floor note on their website, the giant tower that does exist in this version of the city was most likely where Claire's challenge was going to take place after defeating her before the Dragon's Den eventually came into existence, which is pretty cool. Finally, we've got two more locales to cover, both of which come from Sinnoh via the Johto region. Within the 1997 Space World demo of Gold and Silver are two towns, which, as you may have heard, bear a marked similarity to Canalave City and Snowpoint City from Sinnoh. The Canalave lookalike was known as New Type City and was located in eastern Johto, and Snowpoint's counterparts, which were actually two separate towns likely molded into one to create Snowpoint, were known as North Town and Blue Forest Town, and were found in northern Johto. Since Johto at this stage was based on the entirety of Japan outside of Kanto, and Sinnoh is of course also based on an area of Japan, these towns were almost certainly pulled from the vault of cut content and reused 2 generations later when it came time to develop the Sinnoh games, which, if you ask me, is pretty frickin' cool. And there you have it. That was a whole lot of cut content from a whole lot of Pokemon towns. If you guys enjoyed, be sure to leave a like, cause it really helps out, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe if you're new for more content, and once again, a huge shout out to the Cutting Room Floor for cataloging all of this information. A link to them will be in the description below. Also, if you would like to potentially win a free copy of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, be sure to check out my Spotify, because for every 3,000 new listeners I can get there for my Pokemon remixes by the time the games come out, I will be giving away a copy. So give it a look if you're able to, it would be extremely appreciated, and you might even win a free game in the process. With that said, I will be back with another video very soon, and until then, as always, thanks for watching this one. I really appreciate it, and I will smell you guys later.